Today you'll discover the story of Isabella, a young girl abandoned in the scorching Arizona desert, whose journey led her from the depths of despair to finding an unexpected family with a lonely rancher who gave her not just a home, but a name and a future. Get ready for an emotional narrative full of unexpected turns. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. The sun blazed mercilessly over the Sonoran desert, its rays dancing. Off the red rocks and sparse vegetation, Isabella Martinez, barely 8 years old, sat huddled beneath a scraggly mesquite tree, her small frame trembling despite the oppressive heat. Her dark hair, once neatly braided by her mother, now hung in tangled strands around her dirt-streaked face. The pink backpack beside her contained only a water bottle, nearly empty, and a crumpled photograph of a family that no longer wanted. Her drama's 3 days had passed since her Uncle Carlos had driven her out here, promising they were going on an adventure. "Just wait here, mija," he'd said, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'll be right back." But he never returned. Isabella understood now what her Aunt Rosa's whispered conversations had meant. After her parents died in that terrible accident 6 months ago, she'd become a burden, another mouth to feed in a household already struggling to make ends meet. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and rock that seemed to swallow hope itself. Isabella's lips were cracked, her throat parched. She'd rationed the water carefully, remembering her father's camping lessons, but it wouldn't last much longer. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, she heard something that made her heart leap, the distant rumble of an engine. Thomas McKenna squinted through the dusty windshield of his pickup truck, navigating the rough trail that led to the eastern boundary of his ranch. At 62, he'd spent the last 15 years alone on this land, ever since Margaret passed. Away! The cancer had taken her quickly, and with her went his dreams of children and grandchildren, filling the old ranch house with laughter. These days, his only companions were his cattle, his horse Duke, and the memories that haunted the empty rooms. Something caught his eye near the old mesquite grove, a flash of pink that didn't belong in this landscape of earth tones. Thomas slowed the truck, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. A child, a little girl, alone in the desert. He threw the truck into park and jumped out, his boots kicking up dust as he ran toward her. "Hey there, little one," he called out gently, not wanting to frighten her. Isabella looked up with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "My name's Thomas. Are you hurt?" Isabella tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from her dry throat. Thomas quickly retrieved a water bottle from his truck, kneeling beside her. "Small sips now," he instructed, supporting her head as she drank. "That's it. You're safe now." As the water revived her, Isabella's story came out in fragments. The accident, living with relatives who didn't want her, being left here with promises that were lies. Thomas felt a rage building in his chest, the kind he hadn't experienced since his wild younger days. What kind of people abandoned a child in the desert? "Well, Isabella," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "looks like you're coming with me. My ranch isn't far. We'll get you cleaned up, fed-y, and then figure out what to do next." He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she was, how easily she fit in his arms. As he carried her to the truck, he felt something shift inside him, a warmth he'd thought had died with Margaret. The McKenna Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of high desert, with the main house nestled against a backdrop of red cliffs. As they pulled up to the 2-story adobe structure, Isabella's eyes widened. It looked like something from the Western movies her father used to watch. Wooden beams, a wide porch with rocking chairs, and wind chimes that sang in the evening breeze. "It's not much," Thomas said, suddenly self-conscious about the bachelor state of his home. "But it's sturdy and safe." He carried her inside, setting her down gently on the worn leather couch. The house smelled of coffee and leather, with dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. Thomas moved with surprising efficiency for a man who'd lived alone so long. He heated up a can of chicken soup, found some crackers, and set them before Isabella on the coffee table. While she ate, he called Sheriff Patterson, an old friend who'd known him since his rodeo days. The conversation was brief but thorough. Thomas explained the situation, gave the uncle's name and description, and made it clear the child was safe with him for now. "You sure about this, Tom?" the sheriff asked. "Taking in a kid ain't like taking in a stray calf." "I'm sure about not letting her go back to people who'd leave her to die," Thomas replied firmly. "We'll sort out the legal stuff tomorrow. Tonight, she needs rest and safety." After Isabella finished eating, Thomas showed her to the guest room, Margaret's old sewing room that he'd never had the heart to change. The quilt on the bed was one of the last things his wife had made, and a pattern of desert flowers in soft pastels. Isabella touched it reverently, her fingers tracing the careful stitches. "This was my wife's room," Thomas said quietly. "She would have loved to have a little girl stay here. The bathroom's right across the hall. I'll find you something clean to wear. Might be a bit big, but it'll do for tonight." He returned with one of his old t-shirts and a pair of drawstring shorts that could be cinched tight enough to stay on her small frame. "I'll be right. Downstairs if you need anything. Just holler, okay?" Isabella nodded, clutching the clothes to her chest. "Mr. Thomas," she whispered. "Thank you." "Just Thomas is fine, little one. And you're welcome." That night, Thomas sat on the porch, Duke lying at his feet, and stared out at the star-filled sky. He could hear Isabella moving around upstairs, the old floorboards creaking under her light steps. For the first time in 15 years, the house didn't feel empty. He thought about Margaret, how she'd always wanted children, how they'd tried for so long before the diagnosis came. Maybe this was her way of sending him what they'd both wished for, even if the circumstances were nothing like they'd imagined. And the next morning, Thomas woke to an unfamiliar sound, someone else moving around his kitchen. He found Isabella standing on a chair, trying to reach the cereal boxes on a high shelf. She startled when she saw him, nearly losing her balance, but he steadied her with a gentle hand. "Morning, sunshine," he said. "How about I make us some real breakfast? Eggs, bacon, toast, the works." Isabella's eyes lit up. "I can help. Mama taught me to scramble eggs." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Thomas learned more about her life before. Her parents, Miguel and Sophia, had been good people. Her father a mechanic, her mother a seamstress. They'd lived in a small apartment in Phoenix, happy despite having little money. Isabella spoke of Sunday dinners, of her mother's singing, of her father teaching her to name all the tools in his workshop. "They were coming home from my school play," she said quietly, pushing eggs around the pan. "I was a flower in the spring show. They never got to see it." Thomas's throat tightened. "I bet you were the prettiest flower there." After breakfast, they drove into town. Coyote Springs was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Thomas's arrival with a young girl in tow caused quite a stir. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened behind her spectacles. "Thomas McKenna, is that a child with you?" "This is Isabella," he said simply. "She'll be staying with me for a while. We need some clothes that actually fit her." Word spread quickly through the small town. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, half of Coyote Springs knew that the hermit rancher had taken in an abandoned girl. Sheriff Patterson, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples, took Isabella's statement gently, his jaw tightening as she described being left in the desert. "We'll find your uncle," he promised her, "and he'll answer for what he did." In the meantime, Thomas here is a good man. You'll be safe with him." The legal machinery began to turn. Emergency custody papers were filed. Social services was notified. A social worker named Janet Morales was assigned to the case, a no-nonsense woman who'd seen too much but still believed in happy endings. She interviewed Thomas at length, inspected the ranch, and spoke privately with Isabella. "She's been through trauma," Janet told Thomas afterward, "but she's resilient, and she clearly feels safe with you. That's a good start." Days turned into weeks at the McKenna Ranch, and a routine began to emerge. Isabella would wake early, help Thomas with the chickens, and then they'd have breakfast together. He taught her to ride Duke, starting with just walking around the corral. Her natural affinity with animals surprised him. She had a gentle way with them, speaking softly and moving slowly, earning their trust. "You've got the touch," Thomas told her one morning as she fed carrots to Duke. "Not everyone does. Animals can sense a good heart." The investigation into her abandonment moved forward. Carlos Ramirez was arrested 2 states away, trying to cross into Mexico. Rosa, his wife, claimed she'd been against leaving Isabella, but was too afraid to stop him. The courts would decide their fate, but one thing was certain: Isabella would never return to their care. Thomas found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The house, once silent, now filled with the sounds of a child's presence. Footsteps on the stairs, humming in the garden, questions about everything from why cows moo to where stars go during the day. He started cooking real meals again, instead of eating cold sandwiches over the sink. He fixed up the old swing that hung from the oak tree, oiling the chains until they no longer squeaked. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Isabella asked, "Thomas, what was your wife like?" But he was quiet for a long moment, surprised to find that talking about Margaret no longer hurt quite as much. "She was like sunshine," he said finally. "Always smiling, always seeing the good in people. She loved this land, loved the wildflowers that bloom after the rain. She would have adored you. Do you think she would have minded me being here?" "Mind," Thomas chuckled softly. "Isabella, she would have had you moved in within an hour of meeting you. Margaret had the biggest heart of anyone I ever knew. She always said this house was meant to be filled with children." School presented a new challenge. The local elementary was small but well regarded, and Principal Edwards was understanding. About Isabella's situation, Thomas enrolled her for the fall term, but she was behind academically. The trauma and instability had taken their toll. He hired Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher, to tutor Isabella during the summer months. The first day of tutoring, Isabella was nervous, fidgeting with the pencil and avoiding eye contact, but Mrs. Chen was patient and kind, finding ways to make learning feel like a game rather than a chore. Within weeks, Isabella was catching up, her natural intelligence shining through once she felt secure enough to focus. The town of Coyote Springs embraced Isabella in a way that surprised Thomas. Mrs. Henderson always had a piece of candy for her at the store. Doc Williams made sure she got all her checkups and vaccinations, often refusing payment. The other ranchers' wives organized a clothing drive, though they called it a community swap to spare Thomas's pride. One particularly hot afternoon, Thomas was repairing a fence when he heard Duke barking frantically. He ran toward the sound, his heart pounding, to find Isabella cornered by a rattlesnake near the barn. She stood perfectly still, remembering his lessons about not making sudden movements. "That's good, Isabella," he said calmly, though his blood was ice. "Stay just like that." He grabbed a long-handled hoe and, with practiced precision, dealt with the snake. Only after the danger passed did Isabella start to cry, throwing herself into his arms. "Ah, you did everything right," he soothed, holding her tight. "You listened. You stayed calm. I'm proud of you." That night, the weight of responsibility hit him fully. This wasn't just about providing food and shelter. He was responsible for keeping her safe, for teaching her, for helping her heal. The thought was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Janet Morales visited regularly, documenting Isabella's progress. Each report noted improvements: weight gain, emotional stability, academic advancement. Isabella was blooming under Thomas's care, but the legal situation remained complicated. Her parents had no other family in the United States. Back in Mexico, there were distant relatives, but none who could or would take her. "Have you thought about adoption?" Janet asked Thomas one day while Isabella was at tutoring. The word hung in the air between them. Thomas had been thinking about it constantly, but hadn't dared voice it. Would they even consider me? I'm 62, single, no experience with kids except these past few months. You're also the man who saved her life, Janet pointed out, who's given her stability and love when she needed it most. Age is just one factor, Thomas. What matters is what's best for Isabella. Summer gave way to fall, and with it came Isabella's first day at Coyote Springs Elementary. Thomas had never been so nervous, not even when he'd ridden his meanest bull back in his rodeo days. He'd bought her a new backpack, purple this time, her choice, and made sure she had all the supplies on the list. As they stood at the school entrance, Isabella clutched his hand tightly. "What if the other kids don't like me?" she whispered. Thomas knelt down to her level. "Then they're missing out on knowing someone special. You just be yourself, Isabella. That's more than enough." Mrs. Garrett, her third-grade teacher, was a warm woman who'd been briefed on Isabella's background. She took Isabella's hand gently and led her to a desk near the window. Thomas watched through the classroom door as Isabella slowly began to interact with the other children, a tiny smile appearing when a girl with pigtails shared her crayons. The adoption process moved forward slowly. There were home studies, background checks, interviews with psychologists. Thomas threw himself into proving he could provide a good home, taking parenting classes despite feeling foolish as the oldest person there by decades. He child-proofed the house, installed better lighting on the paths, and even learned to braid hair from YouTube videos. Isabella thrived at school, making friends and discovering a love for reading. She devoured books about horses, about the desert, about brave girls who overcame obstacles. In the evenings, Thomas would find her curled up in Margaret's old reading chair, lost in a story. Sometimes she'd read aloud to him, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. One October evening, as they carved pumpkins for Halloween, Isabella asked a question that stopped Thomas cold. "If the judge says yes, would I be Isabella McKenna?" Thomas's hands stilled on the pumpkin. "Would you want to be?" She nodded solemnly. "Isabella Martinez McKenna. So I don't forget where I came from, but everyone knows where I belong." "That," Thomas said, his voice thick, "sounds perfect to me." Halloween in Coyote Springs was a community affair. The main street closed to traffic, businesses handed out candy, and everyone dressed up. Thomas, who hadn't celebrated Halloween in 15 years, found himself wearing a cowboy hat and sheriff's badge, while Isabella dressed as a veterinarian, complete with a toy stethoscope and stuffed animals as patients. As they walked from store to store, Thomas noticed how the townspeople had fully accepted Isabella as one of their own. She wasn't that abandoned girl anymore. She was Thomas's daughter, even if the law hadn't made it official yet. November brought the first court hearing. Thomas wore his only suit, the one from Margaret's funeral, now taken in because he'd lost weight running after an active 8-year-old. Isabella wore a new dress, blue with small flowers, her hair in the French braid Thomas had finally mastered. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Patricia Hawkins, reviewed the case carefully. She questioned Thomas about his age, his health, his plans for Isabella's future. She spoke with Isabella privately in her chambers, a conversation that seemed to last forever, but was only 20 minutes. When they reconvened, Judge Hawkins's expression had softened. "Mr. McKenna, the court has concerns about your age and single status. However, the evidence of Isabella's improvement under your care is undeniable. I'm granting temporary guardianship while the adoption process continues. We'll review again in 6 months." It wasn't the immediate yes Thomas had hoped for, but it was progress. As they left the courthouse, Isabella slipped her hand into his. "6 months isn't so long," she said, comforting him when it should have been the other way around. Thanksgiving arrived with the first light snow on the mountains. Thomas had never made a full Thanksgiving dinner, but he was determined to try. Isabella helped, standing on her step stool to reach the counter, carefully following her mother's recipe for corn pudding that she remembered. They invited Janet Morales, who had become more than just their social worker, and Doc Williams, who had no family of his own. The turkey was a little dry, and Thomas forgot to add sugar to the cranberry sauce, but nobody complained. As they sat around the table, Isabella insisted on saying grace. "Thank you for Thomas," she said simply, "and for Duke, and for my new home, and for second chances." Winter in the high desert brought cold nights and occasional snow, transforming the ranch into a wonderland that delighted Isabella. Thomas taught her to build proper snowmen and showed her how to track rabbit prints across the white landscape. On one particularly cold evening, as they sat by the fireplace with hot chocolate, Isabella pulled out a school project she'd been working on. "It's a family tree," she explained, showing him the poster board. "I put my birth parents at the top, see? And then you're here, connected to me." She'd drawn a heart around his name. Thomas studied the careful work, noting how she'd included Duke and even some of the ranch animals as extended family. "Your teacher's okay with this? It's a bit unconventional." "Mrs. Garrett says family is whoever loves you and takes care of you," Isabella replied. "That's you." Christmas approached, and with it a surprise. Thomas had been in contact with a private investigator, trying to locate any of Miguel and Sofia Martinez's belongings. Most had been sold or discarded by Carlos, but the investigator found one thing: a box of photos and documents in a storage unit. The rent, paid up for a year in advance by Miguel before the accident. Thomas drove to Phoenix alone to retrieve it all, wanting to review the contents before sharing them with Isabella. The box contained treasures, photos of Isabella as a baby, her parents' wedding album, her mother's jewelry box with a few simple pieces, and a leather journal where Miguel had written letters to his daughter for future birthdays. On Christmas morning, after the presents under the tree had been opened, books, art supplies, a new riding helmet, Thomas brought out the box. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she recognized her mother's handwriting, her father's watch. "Yeah, how did you find these?" "Everyone deserves to have pieces of their history," Thomas said gently. "Your parents loved you very much, Isabella. These belong to you." They spent the day going through the photos, Thomas listening as Isabella shared memories triggered by each image. She put her mother's simple gold cross around her neck and carefully placed her father's watch in her jewelry box, saying she'd wear it when she was older. The 6-month review came in April, just as the desert wildflowers began to bloom. Isabella had grown 2 inches, her grades were excellent, and she'd joined the 4-H club, showing a calf at the spring fair. The house had transformed too. Children's artwork on the refrigerator, toys in the living room, a vegetable garden where Isabella grew tomatoes and peppers. This time, Judge Hawkins smiled as she reviewed the reports. "Mr. McKenna, I've seen many adoption cases, but rarely have I seen such a transformation in both a child and guardian. Isabella, do you want to tell me how you feel about making this arrangement permanent?" Isabella stood up straight, her voice clear and certain. "Thomas saved my life twice, once in the desert and once by giving me a home. He's teaching, Me to be strong and kind, like him and like my first parents wanted. He's my dad now, even if the papers don't say so yet." Judge Hawkins's eyes misted slightly. "No, well, I think it's time the papers caught up with reality. Thomas McKenna, the court grants your petition to adopt Isabella Martinez. Congratulations to both of you." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Janet Morales wiped away tears. Doc Williams clapped Thomas on the back, and Mrs. Henderson, who'd closed the store to attend, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. But Thomas only had eyes for Isabella, who launched herself into his arms. "We're a real family now," she whispered. "We've been a real family since the day I found you," he whispered back. "This just makes it official." They celebrated. At the diner in town, the whole community seeming to stop by their table to offer congratulations. Isabella, now officially Isabella Martinez McKenna, beamed at everyone, her joy infectious. That evening, as they returned to the ranch, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. They sat on the porch, Duke at their feet, watching the day end. The wind chimes Margaret had hung years ago played their gentle melody. "Thomas," Isabella said softly, "do you think my parents and Margaret are happy about this?" Thomas pulled her close, thinking about second chances, about love finding a way even through loss and abandonment. "I know they are, sweetheart. I know they are." The desert stretched out before them, no longer a place of abandonment, but of redemption. The ranch that had been too quiet for too long now echoed with laughter, with life, with the sound of a family that had found each other when they needed it most. Isabella Martinez McKenna was home.